Good afternoon. My name is Heather Tanana. I'm a research associate and fellow at the Stegner Center, and I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for the Food Sovereignty and Tribes presentation, Cynthia Wilson. Cynthia is a tribal member of the Navajo Nation. She serves as the Traditional Foods Program Director for Utah Diné Bikéyah. And in that role, Cynthia helps with public land management planning focused on traditional food knowledge that addresses the physical and spiritual health of the land and people. We're so fortunate to have Cynthia share her knowledge and expertise with us. With that brief introduction, I'll turn the time over to her.
Thank you, Heather. And Yate Shay Cynthia Wilson Yunichia, but name Shol Kenya Ani Bashing, Kachitni Dashache, Kachitni Dashana, Tabby Desgate Nasha. I'm a member of the Diné Nation, and my clans are the Folded Arms People's Clan, born for the Towering House Clan, and I'm born and raised here in Monument Valley, Utah, which is in San Juan County, Utah. As Heather mentioned, I work for a Native-led nonprofit called Utah Diné Bikéyah. That's an advocacy group for the protection of Bears Ears National Monument. So we'll go through the slides, and the first slide here talks about our vision. With Utah Diné Bikéyah, it's really centered around healing. And to us, healing is achieved through the process of strengthening our ties to the land, practicing our native cultures, our language, and also strengthening our spiritual connections to our non-human relatives. And throughout this presentation, I'll be using the Four Corners potato as an example of that connection. On the next slide, you'll see a map. And this is a map of San Juan County, Utah. As you can see, the outline in dark blue is Bears Ears National Monument, 1.35 million acres that was designated by former President Barack Obama. And with this was an effort led by the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition, which consists of Diné, Ute, Zuni, and Hopi tribes that advocated for the protection of 1.9 million acres, but Obama designated 1.35. And these efforts by the tribe is, they saw that there's a direct connection between human health and landscape health. And for the first time, we as Indigenous people convinced the U.S. government to write this relationship into law through the Bears Ears National Monument Proclamation. However, in less than a year, that monument got reduced by 85% by President Trump. And on the map, you can see shaded in light blue 2 areas. The bottom portion is currently known as Sheshja National Monument, and the top light blue shaded area is Indian Creek National Monument. And those are the reduced monument by Trump. So the next slide goes more into what the proclamation stated that was written by Barack Obama on December 28, 2016. In the quote, he highlighted in the proclamation that TEK, meaning traditional ecological knowledge, is itself a resource to be protected and used in understanding and managing this landscape sustainably for generations to come, in which to us, traditional knowledge is essential for land management planning, whereas the land itself is essential to each of our cultures. So the next slide shows some images of Bears Ears as a cultural living landscape. In San Juan County, about 50% of the population south of the county is Native American. There's 3 tribes in our county, which is Ute Mountain Ute, Diné, and San Juan Southern Paiute, but only our local tribes in the county have ties to the landscape, but it also extends out to the Pueblo people like Hopi and Zuni and and other tribes, because this area was known as a healing place, and the Pueblos refer it to as a peacemaking place. And it's also known as a trading place. But here, our people are experts in traditional arts. They are healers. They are historians or storytellers, and our elders hold deep ties and vast knowledge for this landscape. Our history is documented on this landscape. It's displayed on the petroglyphs, and we go to this landscape to harvest our medicine, our art tools, our materials, and we still have evidence of our ceremonial homes, and it's an offering place. So it's a very significant place, and this is the reason why the tribes united in asking for the protection of this vast landscape. So the next slide, it really shows my overall work, which is land management planning tied to traditional ecological knowledge as stated in the presidential proclamation. And when we're talking about land use planning, we're talking about traditional foods, the native plant protection, policies that regarding traditional hunting practices or medicinal collection, harvesting, cultural practices, maintaining ties to the land, ceremonial practices, and having that access to our traditional arts, harvesting our materials. So our work is really about engaging our traditional food experts, our cultural practitioners and artists to reactivate this landscape by empowering our cultural concept, which is based on kinship, holistic well-being, and the acts of reciprocity. And a lot of those have been taken away from us, because when we're talking about Bears Ears, we're talking about public lands. Nowadays, it's managed by BLM and U.S. Forest Service. However, the tribes have, once the boundaries were in place with states, counties, and the federal government, it kind of pushed away our cultural practices. So this is the first proclamation that kind of encourages tribes to reconnect to their ancestral landscape. So on the next slide, it's a 2-minute video of an Indigenous food activist speaking on the importance of defending Bears Ears and why restoring traditional foodways is part of this. So we can play that.
Hey, I'm Carlos Bacca. I'm chef and founder of Taste of Native Cuisine. We are here as united tribes from different sovereign nations to put our voices into this fight to possibly strip this place of monument status. The fight for Bears Ears is the fight for food. It's the fight for education. It's the fight for your language. It's the fight for everything that we hold dear that makes us a sovereign people. This is all of our fight. This is everybody in the nation. It's a national monument. It's not just an indigenous fight. This was created just as much for you as it was for us. When you can see tribes that sometimes stand in opposition to each other come together and unite, you know that it's bigger than you. And you know that there's a true ancestral happening here, you know. This knowledge that's up and down these canyons it's Zuni, it's Hopi, it's Nooch, it's Diné. It's all the tribes that traveled through here. There's memories engraved here. There's creation stories here. There's everything that should hold importance to people. But, you know, we have this conversation with everything that has to do with the past, the present, and the future, right? We're at a place in time in our history to where we can be heard in whatever capacity that we have in these movements. You know, stand up for it, use your voice, use your computer, use your hands, I don't care. Don't take your voice away from the battle, however that looks.
All right, so that kind of gives you an idea of the work that we are doing, and more into detail on the next slide, I'll give an overview of what the Traditional Foods program is about. It's really grassroots driven, so I did a lot of elder interviews, farmer visits throughout the Four Corners region, and just to document Native wisdom and to understand their local traditional food systems, with the overall goal of how do we restore our traditional food practices. And this goes along with restoring our connections to being out on the landscape and harvesting our traditional food sources, and also to understand challenges and identifying opportunities to healthy food practices and access to our traditional foods, and to strengthen our cultures in the area of health, food, language, and spirituality. And I think most importantly, to celebrate and restore our relationships with food through our ceremonies, our songs, and our stories. And on the next slide, this food program is really focused on traditional knowledge based on oral stories. And I've documented a lot of this wisdom through these elder interviews and even interviewing our botanists. So it's really tied to place and how we are interconnected to all living, breathing beings, such as the cosmos, the ecosystem, and the elements, and how the earth emulates our body as humans. And when I'm doing these interviews, we're talking about food as a living, breathing being. What powers does food have? What gifts does food offer? And what is our relationship to the foods that we eat? And how do we act as a relative to food, our food relatives? How do we stay interconnected all in this one life zone? And our elders tell us that our plant knowledge, the plants were one of the first people here, and they give us a lot of knowledge and teaching on how this land and the mountains and the vegetation are here for us. So it's a lot of wisdom shared based on prayer, kinship, reciprocity, and having reverence. So on this next slide, I'll talk about a model example of traditional knowledge as stated in the proclamation. When we're talking about native plant protection, we call this native potato the Four Corners potato because it spreads throughout this Four Corners region. It's a tiny wild potato. The scientific name for it is Selenium jamesii. So I work in partnership with University of Utah researchers to integrate traditional knowledge with Western analysis to honor and help us better understand the complete history behind this ancient potato. On the next slide, you'll see a map of the Four Corners region. There's archaeological populations in blue dots, which are tied to cliff dwellings or areas where people had lived and farmed. And then there's the yellow dots that are non-archaeological populations. So we know, again, that throughout indigenous communities, there was many trade routes, and through these trade routes, part of it was the trade routes for food. And we know that ancestral Puebloans traveled long distance to transport, trade, and steward these tubers. So we want this Four Corners potato, the scientific name is Selenium jamesii. It has multiple populations, even within Bears Ears National Monument, that requires special management to ensure persistence. On the next slide, you see a picture of the tiny potatoes being boiled in bentonite, which is a white clay, and that white clay actually reduces the bitterness of the potato. Ancestral Puebloans use these various cooking and processing techniques. and they even grind it on the old grinding stone to make flour or yeast, or they mix it, like in this image, with the white clay, because the potatoes are high in glycoalkaloids. So mixing it with this clay reduces that bitterness. But that glycoalkaloid could also be a protection of the plant itself from insects. So on the next slide, you see an image of a landscape known as North Creek Shelter. And the early research of this potato started back in 2004 to 2008 by Brigham Young University. They documented a variety of dishes dating back 11,000 years at the site through excavation. And this site was on private land, so they got permission from the private land owners to begin this research, and they found like stone tools used to grind sage, saltbrush, and grass seeds into flour. And part of what they found was these old grinding stone you can see on the next slide, where University of Utah researchers that I currently work with took on this study in 2012, where the researcher found starch residue on the old grinding stone of this potato that dated back 11,000 years. On the next slide, it shows an image of the Four Corners potato in the wild, or at Bears Ears, on the Bears Ears landscape. As you can see, this photo was taken back in August of 2017, and all we found at that time was a piece of potato skin. And the potato growing out in the wild is really dependent on the monsoon rain season. And we have our Ute Mountain Ute Alder here that gave a water offering to this native potato plant. On the next slide, it shows a comparison between growing the Four Corners potato in a greenhouse setting compared to how it grows out in the wild. So plants in the greenhouse, when supplied with ample water, good soil, and mineral nutrients, it produces many stems and abundant green foliage, and up to about 100 flowers, and eventually up to 400 tubers from a single mother tuber. So in the image, you can see the flower, how it blooms. It's like a star, has white, it's a white flower with 5 sides, and in the center, it's yellow. And whereas in the wild, the other image, the plants mainly only have one stem from a tuber and a few flowers, but if the monsoon rains are sustained throughout the summer, they can get pretty lush. But the researchers I've worked with have only seen this happen once every 6 years. They have observed them. And these wild potatoes, they're really they can stay dormant for up to 6 years. So they're really resistant and resilient. They are strong, and they know when to come out and bloom. So it's really dependent on the monsoon fall. In the next slide, you can see an image of a ruler and the size of these tiny tubers. From here, I'll talk about how the potato is grown in the greenhouse setting, which is mainly how it was grown in partnership with University of Utah and Red Butte Garden. So when you look at the tubers alongside the ruler, there's a new stem from a single eye at the tip of the tuber, and then there's dots on the tuber, and those are we call them the eyes, which are the growing points. And a typical tuber size is about 10 millimeter. And you can see the comparison to a quarter there. Each tuber with one stem reaches out for the light, and then it produces many roots, as you can see in that image. On the next slide, when it gets to that stage, it's ready for propagation. Once each sprouted tuber is put in a separate pot, we put them in these nursing pots so they can individually produce tubers. But these are just one tuber per small pot at this stage. On the next slide, you can see that the stem starts to make new leaves, and tubers produce underground, and the flowers start to bloom on top. And some of the stems will grow underground as well. And each tuber will produce multiple tubers in each of these pots. On the next slide, you can see that one small tuber that was planted, it gets transported into a larger pot as the flower starts to bloom and more stems starts to produce. And when you plant one tuber, it can produce up to about 200 to 500 new tubers after 6 months in the greenhouse. So it can produce mass amount just by planting one tuber. And in this greenhouse setting, we use a standard potting mix. On the next slide is the fun part where we harvest the potatoes. And depending on the size of your pot, it can be 3 gallon or up to 5 gallon of how much tubers you get to harvest. But you can see in this image, we're washing the tubers as we are harvesting them. And the tubers even rope around the soil. And they're also found within the soil, harvesting from a pot. On the next slide talks about tasting the Four Corners potato. To me, it's a very earthly flavor, and it tastes the same as the modern potato. The interesting thing about the potato is they grow as big as they are planted. So when you plant that one single tuber, you'll produce the same size tuber. So it doesn't grow any bigger than that. And there's no need to peel because as tiny they are. So because also the skin is where all the nutrients are held. But in this image, part of our program, we have an annual Indigenous foods or Indigenous dinner fundraising event that is to fund the traditional foods program. So each year we try to serve these tiny potatoes when we get enough to harvest. And this first image is the potatoes with bison and amaranth. And in the second image, it's potatoes in a corn husk and smoked river trout with wild onions and piñon nuts there in sweet corn curry. And we also have cooked the potatoes, or they have been served in salads, and they also have been served in soups as well. On the next slide, you see the Indigenous chef you saw in the video, who has been our cook during these fundraising events for the traditional foods program. So these tiny potatoes, their nutrition content, it has double the protein, zinc, and manganese, and it also has triple the calcium and iron content than the modern potatoes. So it's very filling and nutritious. On the next slide is our potato cultivation partners. We have put out flyers to look for interested Indigenous farmers throughout the Four Corners region who want to grow these tiny potatoes, and also to to bring these potatoes back into our communities and to re-educate our people that this is something we have always known, and so that the potato could benefit the original stewards and wisdom keepers of these potatoes. The whole role of this project is to validate what Native people have always known and to ensure that we lead our own cultural revitalization through this potato revitalization project. And we also want the Indigenous communities to benefit culturally, spiritually, nutritionally, and economically. Whereas these potato cultivation partners have, in the image, they have a brown sack of tiny potatoes that were harvested from Red Butte Garden in the greenhouse settings, and they each took those tubers home, and this year they're going to grow it within their own farms. And we're hoping that by the end of the year, they would harvest enough to start marketing opportunities to our local restaurant chains. On the next slide, it's just going back to my overall work of land management planning, using this potato as a model example to support the richness of culturally significant plant species, warrant special management, minimize damage from vegetation, livestock, grazing, and invasive species, and most importantly, to restore native plant populations. On the next slide is an overview of the Traditional Foods Program projects, which again, it's really about traditional foods assessment. Right now, it's a 3-year program. The program has been running 3 years, and again, it's very grassroots driven. We've been listening to our elders, our farmers, our medicine people, community leaders, and knowledge holders, understanding the holistic approach tied to nutrition and through this community engagement. And the overall goal is to reconnect tribes to ecologically intact landscape and traditional agriculture practices. So I'll be writing a traditional foods policy report based on the recommendations from these traditional food experts that we are engaging with, and also looking at traditional food models. The last slide is a list of our partners, and overall, working with this project, we have the necessary wisdom to heal the challenges our people face, which is the reason why the work that I do is really tied to the grassroots people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. I thought that was it's really great work that Utah Diné and Bikéyah is doing, and I don't think many people are aware of the traditional food program aspect of the program. So thank you for sharing that information. You know, you had mentioned that one of the goals is to restore traditional food practices. So I wonder if you could just briefly talk about kind of the history and some of the past federal policies that have impacted traditional food practices. You know, some people might commonly think of fry bread or Navajo tacos as kind of being a traditional food, but in reality, that's not true. So I wonder if you can kind of talk a little bit about that and provide some background for individuals that might not be familiar with the history.
Yeah, when we're talking about traditional foods, to me, it really goes back to our creation stories, and it's something that is held dearly to our people, and not many people visit our elders to hear these stories. And it goes back many generations through our oral stories, and which is why a lot of our people, they used to live sustainably, used to grow their own foods, and hunting was very common as well. And it's during decolonization, that really shifted our food system, and the removal of our people from their ancestral lands, like Bears Ears, currently public land. A lot of these removal from our ancestral lands has shifted our food system. And when we're talking about Indigenous people, a lot of the tribes, they have moved around often based on the seasons. And that was a way to preserve the land and the water source as well. That itself was also land management practices by the people. And because of how the impacts of colonization, and even like the boarding school time, which is my parents' time, a lot of these are recent, and many people during our interviews even talked about the historical trauma that affects them to this day. And even with the Diné people, they talk a lot, they reflect back on what had happened to our people during the long walk and how it was very tough. And yet, even during that hardship time, our people had shared their medicine with them. And some elders even talked about how they carried small pouches of food, trying to save the indigenous seeds, and this potato could be one of them. And it shows today that these native foods still exist, like the potato, how it spread throughout the Four Corners region. And this could also tell us a lot about our traditional food trade routes. So there's been a lot of impact that really shifted our ways, especially access. And one thing that I really want to restore when we're talking about Bears Ears is traditional hunting practices, because a lot in the old days, our men used to build sweat lodges across the river and do their whole ritual without any restrictions or policies in place currently by BLM and U.S. Forest Service. It's very different, and they do it in a very humble and respectful way to the animal. And the modern way, when people talk about hunting, it's all about trophy hunting. And to our people, it's really disrespectful during hunting season when you see all these deer hung in the back of their trucks, or when they just hunt just for their antlers or whatever. So it's a lot of work to be done. And I think because of these historical traumas that have happened, many of our people have been silenced. So, but a lot of people are bringing these awareness that we need to change our policies to go back to the ways we have been taught. Mm-hmm. And that is part of the goal with this project.
Thank you. Would you mind telling us a little bit about any challenges you encountered when kind of getting the program developed and how you overcame those challenges?
Yeah, I think oftentimes when we're running a program, usually like being here in Willamette Valley, we often get outsiders come into our communities with projects already in mind, and it never works. So I really wanted this project to be grassroots driven based on the community. And I think one of the challenges is working intertribally because of certain cultural protocols to be mindful of between tribes. And many people that don't work with Indigenous communities don't know that there's a process, which is why this program has been running 3 years, but this 3 years has been mainly just a listening session. Because when we're talking about working with other multiple tribes, we have to go through these cultural protocols, such as funneling down through the cultural historic preservation offices before we talk to the grassroots people. And it takes a lot of relationship building, takes a lot of trust and being present in the communities while we're doing this work. And even the elders, when I talk to them, they say that when you talk about Bears Ears, don't just talk about it as something over there. They're telling us that speak of it as if you are the mountain, that you are Bears Ears. And when you talk about traditional knowledge, you can't talk about it when you don't practice it yourself. So a lot of these have been very encouraging in a way, and it also helps me as a Diné woman to go back and learn about my culture, because I've been kind of distanced from that, being out in through the college education, learning the Western science and the Western way, and then coming back home and realizing that our way is more sustainable and also has more teachings, and a lot of us take that for granted. And for me, myself, my grandfather was one of the well-known medicine men in our area, but he passed when I was about in 8th grade. So now I'm grateful that my work allows me to visit all these elders and gain a lot of that knowledge back.
So great. And are you engaging a lot with the youth to get them involved? Has that been a challenge? Or do you see the younger generation really thirsting for, to connect with their traditional backgrounds and to learn this information and pass it on to their kids?
Yeah, that's actually my next target population, because a lot of our elders are passing of old age with all this knowledge. My priority at the beginning of this project was to listen and document, audio record their stories tied to food and Bears Ears. So when I talk to the elders, they all strongly recommend that we re-educate our youth, that we engage our youth and create real spaces to educate these traditional food practices and rituals. So I got funded this year to implement and put into action the recommendations that were given to me from the elders, which is really strengthening that intergenerational relationship between elders and youth.
That's great. So I'm wondering, going forward to whether it's expanding the work that's happening now in kind of this Four Corners region, or for other tribes in other areas of the country, what policy change do you think should happen to be able to empower tribal nations, tribal communities to engage in programs like this, to, address their traditional food needs, whether it's at the federal level or the tribal level?
Yeah, policies is kind of a tough topic, especially as tribes with a lot of broken promises, even within our treaties. And it seems like we still struggle in practicing our sovereignty. And especially with foods, there's a lot of policy issues that impact our traditional food practices, especially with USDA or the Western sciences that come into our community and don't really follow cultural protocols when engaging on our landscape or with the people. So and I do know, I recently attended, I know with the Diné Nation, our president he's a big advocate for healthy foods, and he went through a life change lifestyle change himself. And so one of his recommendation was food policy changes by looking back into our fundamental laws of nature. And I think utilizing that and understanding that, educating the Western-minded people of how that impacts our ways and how that needs to be uplifted within our communities to continue their cultural practices. It's important. And so I attended, there's a group here called the Diné Food Sovereignty Alliance that have been holding tribal food policy meetings. And it's really interesting because when we come into these Native communities, we can't just, there's a lot of impacts that surrounds that, such as the poor infrastructure. Oftentimes water is a big issue, water access, and we have impacts of uranium exposure, uranium contamination of our water wells. And we also have constant oil spills in San Juan River that kind of pushes back our farmers from using that river for their irrigation. Especially like in Montezuma Creek, Utah, we used to have a lot of farmers, but now they're kind of afraid because of these constant oil spills. Mm-hmm. And all these environmental impacts kind of pushes away our agricultural practices as well. So it's multiple things, and it's just, yeah, what can we do? And these meetings are kind of something that we are discussing as well.
Right, right. And I know some tribes are starting to look at climate change and how to address it. How do you think climate change plays a role in a program like the Traditional Foods Program?
Yeah, I think for me, when we talk about traditional knowledge, revitalizing our cultural foodways, our cultural practices, because to us it's a life teaching, since it's life teachings that are passed on from our elders, and it's really teachings about sustainability and upholding our accountability as the five-fingered earth people. And I think because most of us have shifted over to the modern lifestyle and have forgotten our traditional ways of life, has really impacted all these climate crises, such as the extractive resources, or even the grocery stores shifting to foods that have been foreign to us and consuming those that are causing our sickness, rather than staying connected to our own foodways and our relationship to the landscape. How are we being a good relative to the landscape, to the water, to the mountain people, the air people? So losing a lot of those cultural teachings, I think, is part of the result of what we are seeing here today with our climate change.
Yeah. And then just one last question I had. You're talking about the health benefits of these traditional foods. I was really kind of struck by the potato and all the nutrients that it had in such a small little, little food item. Are you aware, or do you think of any efforts to do this, or do you think it's a good idea for tribes to look into, for tribal communities to market their traditional foods and to sell them, to non-native communities?
Yeah, the potato project, first and foremost, we want it to be native driven. And we do want to market it not just to Native communities, but to neighboring non-Native communities where we rely on their businesses as well. But the way I see it is when we're talking about traditional foods, like this program compared to being in a healthcare setting, there's a whole different conversation happening. Like when you're in a clinical setting, which I could be working as a nutritionist in a clinical setting, but I would have to use materials from the USDA or educating about the My Plate, which doesn't really reflect on our teachings as the Diné people. It also pushes away our practices and our knowledge behind our corn foods, and our potatoes, because diabetes is huge and common in our community. Yet when we go to the clinic, they tell us to stay away from starchy foods like corn and potato, but they don't know that our traditional way, we actually utilize our corn to, we make it with ash that brings out the protein out of our indigenous corn. And when we talk about potato, we think of the wild potato that is more nutritious than this modern potato. So it confuses our people in how we view food as a source of who we are, opposed to being in a clinical setting, saying that you can't have these certain foods or these foods are not good for you. Yeah, so they're just that difference, and I think educating in a way that we know from the holistic perspective would have more benefits to our people in restoring our healthy life ways.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Cynthia. We're so glad that you were able to be a part of our symposium this year, notwithstanding the format change and challenges we've encountered. So thank you again for your time. I learned a lot. I'm sure everyone who will be listening to this will learn a lot as well. And before we close up, I do want to make a note to thank our principal funders of the symposium. It includes the R. Harold Burton Foundation, who's been a founding donor since 1996, and the Cultural Vision Fund, as well as thanking our sponsors, S.J. and Jesse E. Quinney Foundation, Nature Conservancy in Utah, and the Natural Resources Law Firm. Thank you.